Would you still have the same lifting regime for a javelin thrower? As you mentioned, athletes like to feel strong before a competition. So I think
So
that,
I assume Katie's referring to a female athlete. Yes, I would. I still javelin is slightly different because it's obviously a much more elastic than the other throwing events. But I still, it's still about finding the exercises that maximize how that athlete feels and maximizes their performance. And you just have to practice it and play with it, try it. There's no simple way of working this out. It's just about trying, suck and see. You try an exercise, and generally I'll start with what they like, what they think makes them feel good leading into a comp, and then I'll try it, and then manipulate that exercise, for instance, until I find what that athlete likes, and it gives me what I think is the performance outcomes we're after.
So, Mark, how do you decide which competitions you're going to use as practice ones where you're going to practice like a 2 week cycle or whatever into a peak? How do you identify which ones those are when you've got young athletes who, every weekend they want to try and throw a PB or whatever? How do you go about creating that?
But I wouldn't do a 2 week taper with a young athlete. I would just because they're so used to they're throwing every other weekend through most of the summer.
Okay, so older athletes then, what would you do?
So older athletes, well, club competitions, even, it depends on the level of the athlete, obviously. If they're international level athlete, then the likelihood that a county champs isn't an important comp for them. So that might be in the UK, it's generally second weekend in May. So for me, that's an ideal time to try, or some club comps are starting in April, so we can try some of those protocols in those competitions. And obviously it's not trying to get all that information in 1 year as well. We build on that each year. So I'll try something 1 year, see how it works. And then the information I'm gathering is because I'm looking at that athlete getting to a really top level, and I've gathered all this information every year and played around with different scenarios to get what I think is the best scenario for that athlete, or the best protocols leading into that for that athlete.
I think one of the things that I've tried with some of the athletes that I've coached is just involve them quite a lot in the planning process, so they can see, my old coach used to make me do primary, secondary, and tertiary level competitions. I tend to go gold, silver, and bronze because that seems to engage the athletes a bit more. And just say, right, your England champs or your English schools is the gold competition, and then you might have your regionals, so your northerns, your midlands, whatever it might be, and then before that, any club level stuff might be your bronze level. So they've got a clear picture, and then it's part of it's a training competition, but it's planned in around that. So I think. Go on.
I was going to say, for young athletes, that are still progressing in the sport, getting to the English schools might be their primary target. So then they've got to look at, so in their case, the county champs are probably a reasonably important competition. So I wouldn't choose that to try things out. And I don't play around with young athletes too much anyway, because they just want to throw, and they're used to throwing a lot. And so for me, I spend much more time on the technical aspects of throwing with young athletes, A, because you want to establish a good technical model when they're younger, but B, it's the best thing that's going to help them throw further at that particular time.
Yeah, cool. That was a question for me, sorry, as well. I'm going to get some more out there. So we've got another question in. So from Philomena, for a junior athlete regarding before comp technical and speed sessions, any specific speed sessions for shot put or discus thrower? So recommendations of specific sessions.
Yeah, okay. So, and it's not particular to the event either. So when I mean speed, I would use speed and jump sessions because I want the athlete to be fast and explosive. So I would do short sprints, and that can be between 10 and 30 meters, depending on what I'm trying to achieve. Do I want them to be explosive from a standing start? Is that going to be useful for me if that's what I think the athlete needs? Or I might extend it to 30 so they pick up a little bit of speed. Doing some jumps, even just tuck jumps. so they get some reactivity, or bunny hops, so they get some reactivity into the body leading up to the comp. You can. I don't tend to play around with technical aspects. I just concentrate on the technique. So I wouldn't try and throw faster or use different weight implements leading into a comp. I'd keep the same implement weight and size, and I'd concentrate on the physicality in making them fast and explosive. But the technical, it would just be working on the key points that we've chosen to work on leading into that comp.
Cool. Thank you. Question in from Hazel. So, tapered, when reducing from 5x5 to 4x1s, roughly, like you mentioned in your presentation, do you use the same weight or something closer to 1 rep max?
Yeah. So 5x5 generally is around 85% of your 1 rep max. 4 sets of 1 would probably be in the 90 to 93% range. So high load, 1 rep, rest, then have another one. So it's not fatiguing because you're not using a lot of energy to do 1 lift explosively. So that's what we tend to do.
So on the fatiguing bit, sorry, are you saying it's not, you talk about peripheral and central fatigue.
Yeah.
Is lifting in that manner not peripherally fatiguing? Yes. So it's not going to damage muscle, but it's centrally fatiguing because you're having to use a lot of muscles in order to achieve that maximum. Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
So I don't want to be too scientific, but the energy we get from muscles is from ATP, and we wouldn't use lots of ATP with 1 rep, which we would if we were doing multiple reps. And so the energy retains in the muscle, but at the same time, it's priming the central nervous system, the neural system that fires the muscles to be ready.
We've got a comment and a question in from Bron. Sometimes she sees on Power 10 that athletes has reached a PB in the first peak of winter, but doesn't go anywhere near the second peak in the summer. So any thoughts on that? I've got some specific thoughts on that because that was one of the issues that I faced with an athlete that you mentored me with. So I
have got some thoughts on that, and it's happened to me, or if not peaked in the winter, they've peaked very early in the summer season, so May, and when the main competitions were in August, and you get a dip down. You're always going to get a dip down after a peak, and you don't want that in the season. So my thoughts on that are, I think athletes, especially if the athletes had a really good winter, they're coming out of doing lots of work. They know they've done lots of work. If they know they're in reasonably good form, they want to show it, and they're really in a good physical space, and they want to show it. So they get this really good performance because they've talked themselves in mentally to being in a strong place. And I think that's largely why we see some good performances in a winter peak, even for the long throws. And sometimes, those athletes probably don't replicate that performance throughout the summer, or maybe not quite get back to it. Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think. I think it also, if that happens, then I'll look at my programming and I'll look at what's gone wrong, because something would have gone wrong, and it might have been a mental issue with the athlete that I haven't picked up on early enough, or it might be I've got my planning wrong slightly, and I need to change what's going on to bring that other peak back in the summer, which should then be a higher peak.
So with my specific example, it was literally a PB less than a meter away from Commonwealth Games qualification, which was what the target was that year. Yeah. And it was a PB on the first throw that he did of the first competition that he did that year, which gave him, I think it was a GB vest, the first GB vest that he ever had based on that throw. So, but it was exactly what Mark's saying there. He was an absolute stud. He'd just done a load of work, come out, knew that he was in fantastic shape. So physically and psychologically, fully ready and fully committed to achieve a great throw, which he did for him, personal best, never got past it again in a competition. And I think the bit on reflection is, well, we needed to take the learning from that cycle that we're doing, that peaking cycle, into it. But I think the biggest bit for me was to start thinking about how do I plan for success. And I think as a coach, I'm always looking for, oh, we could probably get a little bit of distance if we did this physically different, or we get a little bit different if we did this bit different from a technical perspective, or whatever. And it was when we then started to, and with athletes that I've coached subsequently, it's a much bigger focus on, right, if things go really, really well, what do we do then? So it's looking at how we model practice competitions or practice sessions where it goes really well and you achieve everything that you set out to achieve, and it's what happens then. So yeah, it was a big learning curve for me as a learning point for me as a coach.
And a lot of the time, it's got nothing to do with your planning. You just haven't picked up on the mental approach that the athletes had and how they've reacted after that big, massive PB, for instance. They'll either go two ways. They'll either drop right away, or they'll keep pushing. They want to keep pushing. The problem is they're in a position in the year generally when they can't keep pushing, because you've then dropped them back into another load of work, with the plan to bring them back out of it to peak again in the summer. But a lot of it, I think a lot of it is mental, how the athletes handle it mentally, their psychological approach to, and as you say, Nick, if you plan for that in training, as I said in my earlier presentation, sometimes you're going to exceed where you are. What happens if you suddenly do this big PB when you weren't expecting it? How do you deal with that? So talk through those scenarios with your athletes, that's a possibility as easily as a bad performance.
It's the what if scenario setting.
Yeah.
Just what if this happened, what if that happened? And as a coach as well, you'll build a bank of more what if questions, because you'll get more experience and expose yourself to different mentors, different environments, and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's the whole like what if it goes really well is a really good sort of discussion to have on the way to comps, like driving, all that type of stuff. But
I hope that answers Bron's question.
Hopefully.
Elaine,
Next
hi,
one from Elaine. In the pre-comp lifting sessions, do you only do one exercise at a reduced volume, so 24 hours before, or is it a series of exercises? So I think, do you want to give a specific example as well of where you do this? I know there's a particular athlete you use who benefits from this, and that toning. Toning.
All right. Well, the true answer to that is there's no simple answer. It depends on what the athlete needs, and I say that's where the playing with it and exploring and finding out what suits each athlete is interesting. And you have to keep quite accurate notes on what's going on with athletes, and a big part of that is them telling you how they react and how they feel, and being honest with that reflection. I use my athletes. I encourage them to be totally honest with me, because then we can plan it. If they're not being honest, then it's very difficult for me as a coach to plan it, because I'm not 100% certain on their reaction to what I want to plan.
So you mentioned like a lot of stuff before about the potential stressors that you have, and then you want to try and monitor it. So like, I think, what methods do you put in place? Like, what questions do you ask? What things do you you monitor? So you might monitor like their training loads, so the reps that they've lifted. So it might be the total volume. So the tonnage. You might measure the volume of throws. Do you do things where you measure their furthest throw, their shortest throw? Do you measure like what are these other metrics you mentioned, like their well-being and their sleep and things like that? So what things do you, just if someone wants to build their own sort of questionnaire
I don't tend to measure accurately training throws. I'll tend to I'll put a marker out of a distance that's appropriate for that athlete, and then I know where they are. They know where they are. I know where they are in terms of what they're doing. Now, you have to make sure the athlete doesn't try and throw hard to achieve that distance. They need to be thinking about the technical aspects you're working on, that marker is just out there, just as a signpost of where we are with that. So if I want to make a technical change, I need to know what's that change to the distances they're throwing. So it's just a marker for me. In terms of how I've used it in the past, it's about practicing it. I mean, I've seen athletes that do like a jump pull, repeated jump pulls within hours of the competing, and it's just to stimulate them to feel like they want to throw. So that's why it's a difficult question to answer, because it's
give it
the athlete one or needs.
It's a difficult one to answer. So the idea is creating that stimulus for the central nervous system. So maybe as a specific example. So what do you do with Phoebes, for example? Because I know she likes to do pre-throw sessions like a day before. What do you do with her?
Yeah, she does. Well, so from a throwing perspective, it's just she's one in particular likes to feel really strong leading into a comp. So her lifting will stay right up to the comp. And so if a comp's on a Saturday or a weekend, she'll still lift reasonably heavy on the Thursday because she wants to feel that way.
And will it be the full session, or will it be like one key lift?
There would be one key lift, but it would probably be for her. And this is where it's different with females. So for males, that Thursday session before a comp would be 1 or 2 key lifts. For females, and Phoebe in particular, she'll probably do 4 or 5 lifts. Because she wants to feel she's really strong. And the only way she feels that is if we load her. And I've looked at how she recovers from that. And most of the time, there has been, I think, once where her legs didn't feel good, but the rest of the time she's felt good. And so I have to rely on her feedback and how she feels, because I can't accurately measure it properly or accurately. So in answer to your question, Elaine, I would say it depends on the athlete. Some athletes I might only do one exercise, and that tends to be males. Females, I might do more than one.
So Elaine, I think go and play around with it. Be willing to fail. Be willing to have competitions where the athletes are totally overbaked and then slightly underbaked, but it's all part of that learning. So I think go and experiment, see what works for that individual. You might have totally different responses, and it's an exciting sort of proposition potentially.
You have to play and experiment. If you want to get to the elite level, they don't all do exactly the same thing. But each elite athlete I know has 1 or 2 things that are unique to them, or not necessarily unique to them, but it's their thing that they want to do. And it's finding those.
Yeah. Right, next question. So from Michael, how do you help an athlete as a fear factor before a throw, and also might be dealing with exams? So quite a common thing, especially when we want them to peak when they've got GCSEs and everything else.
They're sort of 2 different questions, really, aren't they? So when they're dealing with exams, I lay right off them and I'm guided by them. Although I do advise them that if you're revising for exams, you need to have breaks. So what you do within those breaks, because they want to do well in their exams and their performances, so they're on board with something that will help them. It's just giving them ideas on what they can try during an exam. But for me, if they're revising, they need to have breaks so we can utilize those breaks by doing something that's going to help their performance. And it takes their mind off their revision, lets them think about something they really enjoy and want to be good at, and then they can go back to their revision. So it's about breaking that up. And in a way, at the moment, like with Zara, that's happening with Zara at the moment, because she's doing full days of online learning from school. So we're utilizing the breaks she takes between to go training. So we're fitting it in around her schoolwork, because she's in quite a high pressure school where she's got to do well. So it'd be the same for exams. I come back off with no pressure on them, and let them dictate a little bit more to some extent. But again, it comes down to how well you know your athlete.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me in that sort of period is if they're spending more time hunched up at a computer and all tangled up or whatever,
Yeah.
then I need to make sure that they can feel long and loose. And I think sometimes when people have got that pressure of exams and everything else, they then tighten up on
Yeah.
top of sitting in that position. So I'll probably spend a lot of time trying to loosen the athletes off and put a greater emphasis on, self-maintenance, recovery, making sure that they're getting really good sleep and nutrition, like hygiene, like all that type of stuff. So that when they come and throw, even if it's a reduced volume because they can only have a shorter session, they're at least feeling better in it. And it makes them, rather than just tight and expect big things because they've got that.
That's one of the things I get them to do if they to break up their revision or their schoolwork. They can do some loosening and mobility work in between to focus on that rather than their schoolwork, and then go back to their schoolwork. And as you say, it helps their postural control, but it also makes them feel a little bit better and loosen off, and it's different. So that's how I'd handle exams. I take the pressure off. I fully appreciate that education really comes above the sport. So I need to maximize both and give them the freedom to be able to explore both.
And in terms of the fear factor, like what is causing that? I would try and unpick and find some really good questions to try and get under the surface as to what is it? Is it a fear of failure? Is it a fear of being judged by other people or other people on the other side of the world who see them on Power 10 or World Rankings, whatever it might be? Like, what is it? What is it in the fear? Like some people just have never competed in the vest before, so that's quite a daunting prospect for them, and they don't have body confidence or whatever it might be. So I'd spend some time trying to understand the fear and what's causing that, and then maybe see if you can set some smaller goals and landmarks within the competition potentially.
Yeah, you're right. You definitely have to dig down and find out what's actually, why there's a fear factor. What is the fear factor truly about? And that can be done in a very friendly way. Okay, you've got this fear. What do you think it is? And get the athlete to respond to that and work through a process of where they are. Once you find out what they're really afraid of or fearful of, then you can tackle it. But until you find out what it is, it's a bit more of a, it might be that they're fearing about fouling all the time. They don't get many successful throws or something. Then once you know what it is, you can work at that. So, maybe work on a smaller circle. Like with the discus, I'll put the hammer boards in so they work off a smaller circle. Just on technique, not a lot, but I do that so they get used to working in a smaller space if they're coming out the front of a circle. You've got to find what that fear factor is before you can deal with it.
Yes, that whole how you develop your sessions, task, environment, athlete, and what part of that do you need to change to create an environment for them to learn. I think a good one I've done is like someone that's it has fear that they're not going to be able to make the final. So we'll work out what the qualification distance for the final, the automatic qualification distance is, and we'll set. So we'll do like 5 sets of 3, 6 sets of 3, or whatever, or even just 3 sets of 3, where they've got to hit within 5% of the automatic qualification line, and then they go from there. But we might start like 6 weeks out, right? You've got to be 10% from the automatic qualification. And then 8, then 6, then 4, or whatever, and we build it up like that. I would find out what the fear is. Just going to go on to the next one because we've got a few questions coming in, and we've also got some really good comments coming in about what people have to. We've got one coming in from Craig and from Bron about what they actually monitor and what worked for them. So it's really good to see what people are doing. So question in: so if we don't have access to a gym on the day of competition, would flexibility exercises be okay? So Mark,
I would. Right. So I would take it that you think the gym is needed for an exercise that they need, because otherwise you wouldn't know that. So, but I would play around with bands probably. They're much better than just working on flexibility. You can get into positions and create explosiveness through a range that would be useful in competition. I use a lot of jumps because it's not just about the throwing, it's about being explosive. So I'll use a lot of jumping activities because that makes you feel explosive. That's about it, really. If you haven't got, but you know, from your question, you'd need to. What you're saying is that you've practiced it with a gym, and then you need to try and replicate that. Well, yeah, that's a difficult one. If you're expecting to have a gym and there isn't one, I would try and find a gym. It's because you can do it 24 hours before the comp. So, you know, that might be the you find a gym the 24 hours before, and then you go to the comp the next day. Other than that, I would find things like bands that I could use that would try and maximise their performance.
Yeah, I think that's a good shout. The strength bands in the bag, ready to pull out when they needed. Resisted sprints, all that type of good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, another question in. Oh yeah, I saw this in before. So the comment around like winter championships, national championships, that is definitely something that we're looking at trying to do. So Mark's already mentioned that the Loughborough winter throws. So ideally we want to try and make that into the British winter throws and it acts as a championship. Like you've got the indoor British champs. But then we also need to think, well, what does that look like further down the pathway? So athletes who are not going to get access to the British senior winter throws, what do we need to put on to be able to support them? I mean, I would love to sit here and say, yes, we want to have an indoor venue that allows you to throw discs indoors, hammer, jab, all that type of stuff. It would be great. But I think realistically, and the weather that we've got, it's looking at athletes that are further down the pathway about, well, can we put an alternative competition on? Might not have to be at Loughborough because obviously that's a big, expensive, like high performance centre or whatever, but we could look at putting something on in that time. I think from my perspective, and I know like Mark, we've seen it when we've been mentoring and supporting these athletes and their personal coaches, having a winter competition is really, really helpful for us because we can see, right, did the stuff they did through the winter period work? If not, why not? If it did, great. What do we learn from that? But then it's also, what do we need to do now ahead of the outdoors? So that Mark talked about that double peaking. Sometimes it really helps us learn how we mentor and support you guys and what support services need to be put in place, what interventions need to be put in place ahead of it. But yeah, I did a double peaked year with Alan when I coached him and I went out to Sweden. So I think if we can do it, and I think it was, if we can get it over in England, I think that would be much better for us. So, but we need to look at doing that like strategically rather than just on a whim. So, questions have dried up. I'm going to on this type. I'm going to stick what
did Craig say?
So I'm just going to put on the group so everyone can see it. So he started training a little bit differently. He has to fill in 2 surveys every day. First is about sleep, feeling, hurt, mood, all that stuff. Second session is how hard the session was, the length of the session, and any comments. So are you using RPE load, Craig? So rate of perceived exertion. So it's rate from 0 to 10, 10 being we need to take you off into an ambulance because you're so broken from the session, and 0 and 1 being it's just a stroll in the park.
Yeah.
And then you load.
And exactly, Craig. So, as you said, using that data of how you feel is part of the story of how you get to a peak. And once you start to keep diaries of this and you start to see patterns emerging, it starts to give you really useful information. But you don't know that if you don't start collecting all that data.
It's interesting now, Craig, as well, that you've started to measure your training throwing distances, because I know we'd have a conversation about that and whether that was going to go into your program. So intriguing. So right, Mark. So how do you work out? So if you got a session where if you run that session, you know that the athlete is going to be ready. So do you have a specific question for what a session for one athlete that you would use? Do you have a different session for? You mentioned the shot putters.
Yeah.
If you got like a nugget session that you would do, that you go, right, if they complete this to this sort of standard, I know that they're going to go on and absolutely fly.
I mean, it's nothing groundbreaking or anything. I mean, I monitor technically as well. So in the shot put, for instance, we would have a distance of feet down, a distance for reverse, a distance for a pivot, a distance for a full turn. And so normally in training, each of those different throws tell us something different about the technical performance in that throw. And so we're monitoring that anyway. So we know roughly what distance this athlete's gonna throw for a particular type of throw, whether that be a feet down or a reverse or whatever. So that gives me information on how well that athlete is ready leading into the competition from a technical point of view. Are they hitting the distances that we expect them to hit for each of those phases, or is one of them not performing well? In which case, it tells me something that's not quite working, and we'll spend more time working on that in that last week. So that's one thing we do. And some athletes have a really terrible last training session. Actually, quite a few do before a big competition. And I think my advice there is don't panic, because if you know the athlete is normally in a really good place and they just have a really crap last session, it's generally because they're thinking too much about the competition. And so you just say, don't worry about it. The competition, you know where you are, move on. The comp's going to be good. But in terms of physical training, I like to use counter movement jumps a lot to monitor where the athlete is. And for me, that's one of my main monitors of athlete preparedness, along with RPE. So I use RPE. I don't often use it as much as I should do, as that's one of my research areas. But I will. I'm going to be using RPE a lot more. The problem with RPE, and it's a really good tool, and if you don't know what it means, it's the rating of perceived exertion. And as Nick suggested, I use a scale of 0 to 10. It takes a while for the athlete to report that RPE accurately, but once you've got it, you can use it for every type of training. And it's called anchoring. So you anchor the scale to what the athlete understands. And once you've got an accurate, the athlete is accurately reproducing the correct RPE, you can then use it across everything. All their weight training, all their sprinting, all their jumping, or even their throwing. How do you feel? How does that make you feel? And you can use it as an overall, how do I feel physically? You can even narrow it down to how does that muscle feel? How does your quadricep feel on a scale of 0 to 10? So you choose how you want to use it. I would suggest you don't overkill it and use it in so many different types of things. I tend to just get the athlete, as Craig put in his one, he monitors how he feels. I would have a wellness one for that, but I'd use RPE in terms of how does that session feel, because I think it gives you more information, and the more information you have about an athlete, the better you can prep. But going back to the session about an athlete, Nick. So yeah, if it was a Saturday comp, then they would have done. So one of them would have gone in and done bench press within 24 hours before the comp, and actually we've done two protocols have worked. One was to do 4 sets of 1 at 93% the 24 hours before, and then about 6 hours before, they went and did a very light explosive bench as well. So we've pre-fired the neural system 24 hours before, and then we've gone in and woken it up 6 hours before or something. That seems to have worked very well, for sure. And long throws are a bit different, I think. They tend to be a little bit different, but you still can find the exercises that the athlete that maximizes their performance.
Okay, so my last question, and I know that people need to shoot off and stuff, but that's fine. If you can fill in the feedback survey after, that would be brilliant. So if you had 100% of your time and effort and what you think is really, really important, and we're going to play like say it's £1 million, like the £1 million drop, and you had all the different variables that you thought were important. So you got your £100 or your £1 million. How much are you putting on technical? How much are you putting on physical? How much are you putting on tactical? And how much are you putting on psychological. So you've got your four main things: tech, tactics, psych. What do you think are the key variables in order to reach peak at championship? You've got your $1 million. Where you put
at what point?
So when you're thinking about the key peaking point, so you've got like however long that peaking phase is, what do you think is most important to be peaking?
Psychological.
Okay, so how much of your million you're putting on psych?
I would probably put 70% on psych.
Right, okay. So you've put $700,000 on psych. Okay, what are you splitting the other 300 with?
I would hope that technically you don't need to work too much on it, but it's just reinforcing what all the work you've already done. So I'd put 100 on that, and then 200 on physical prep leading into it.
So nothing on tactical. Do you think that'll be covered with the psychological?
Yes, I do, because tactics in the throws are all about yourself. It's not about the opposition, really. It's about yourself. And if you maximize your performance, as you know, if the athlete can maximize performance as they know they can, then you can't do any more about it anyway.
Okay, so 70.
So it is the psych. It is,
Right, 700 grand on psych, and 200,000 on physical, 100,000 on technical, and nothing on tactical. Interesting. I wonder how other people would spend their money when it comes to a peaking phase.